Good morning. As you may assume, I'm not Michael Silber. I'm Chaim Gertner, working now at Yad Vashem, previously at the Hebrew U. But I'll replace Michael Silver, who is not here today. And I would like to present our first speaker in our morning session, Facing Modernity, the Jewish Dimension. And I'm very honored to introduce Professor Joshua Shaines, who will talk about political modernization among Galician Jews. Joshua Shaines is Professor of Jewish Studies and Director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies at the College of Charleston. He has published widely on modern Jewish politics, culture, and religion. His first book, Diaspora, Nationalism, and Jewish Identity in Habsburg Galicia, in Cambridge 2012, demonstrates how Zionism, like its non-Jewish counterparts, was first and foremost a movement to nationalize Jews, to construct a modern Jewish nation, while simultaneously masking its very modernity. As a postscript, he has just published his comprehensive study of the 1911 Drohobych Election Day massacre with Austrian History Yearbook, and is currently writing a history of Orthodoxy for the Rutgers series on keywords in Jewish studies. Please.
Thank you, not Michael Sober. I appreciate you stepping up. I'm going to hit, wow, look at that. I hit nothing. There it is waiting for me. I wrote, it's 9:39 and 47 seconds. I'm watching the time. I wrote a ridiculous amount. There's no possibility of me reading all of this. Half the pages I just wrote skim. So we'll see how much I get through. It's really an honor to be here. It's a bit frightening to be here in front of so many of my teachers and colleagues, senior colleagues and peers. I'm going to try to give something of a synthetic review of the topic of the modernization, political modernization of Jews in general, and of course Galician Jews in particular. And we'll see where it goes. And so here we go. So let me start. I had a few days before this conference and between the time they asked me to give the lecture to spend time at Van Leer at the library. And by the way, looking at modernization, it's a wonderful library. Some of the books may be a bit dated. The 1967 seems to be a collection. I have to remember to donate my library when I retire. But the kind of definitions of modernization that they came up with, very focused on the classic definitions coming from Weber and so on, right? So one author wrote modernization, rationalization, differentiation, individualization, or differentiation, equality, capacity, thinking about the state, economic transformation, and so on. Or Benjamin Schwartz wrote, systemic, sustained, and purposeful application of human energies to the rational control of man's physical and social environment for various human purposes. Or another one, Robert Ward, society characterized, this is modernity, by its far-reaching ability to control or influence the physical and social circumstances of its environment, and by a value system which is fundamentally optimistic about the desirability and consequences of this ability. Or another one, rapidly widening control over nature, progress, ideal of progress, and so on. So it's not just about, increasingly about, as you go through the books in the library, you get closer to today, about rationality and secularization, but also what one scholar called the psychic mobility, a kind of transformed worldview bigger than the local, and the ability to change through social and political action. This new transformed worldview is part of the centralizing state. And Eli, I don't know if he's here, but his classic study of modern Jewish politics on the importance of a popular will as the basis of political authority, and, as we know from Benedict Anderson, and I'll come back to him later, social communication, the ability to affect larger and think about larger and larger areas. As Claude Welch put it, widespread awareness of and participation in national politics characterizes a modern society, not a traditional one. Fair enough. And mass politicization is a huge part of this, right? Secularization, but with varying levels of intervention by religion and religious authorities, challenging the secularization, but more importantly, adapting to it. As Donald Smith wrote, religion may contribute to the process of mass politicization, but providing sacred symbols that acquire political significance. Clerical organization, lay interest groups, and religious political parties find in these sacred symbols an important key to mass support, a key that their secular rivals in the struggle for power have denied themselves. And I'm going to challenge that assertion that the secular rivals deny them this key, because they don't. They use them. The use of religion for the purpose of political mobilization can be manipulative, but it need not be. In many cases, the projection of sacred symbols into the political arena proceeds from a holistic worldview which denies the sacred secular distinction. And that's the key for me. And he concludes, by the way, this is 50, 40 years ago, religion helps to produce mass politicization and then declines politically as increasing numbers of participants come to perceive politics as a relatively autonomous area of human activity. Yeah, the decline of religion in politics doesn't seem to have worked out that way. He's describing the post-Third World War. That's what everyone in the 70s was interested in, the post-colonial Third World. But he easily could have been describing our own topic, our Jews here, right? Except that the dichotomy between the secular and the religious, and particularly the labeling of nationalism as something purely secular and opposed to religion, that's my problem. That, to me, is ill-conceived. And what I want to know is, as one other person put it, to what degree traditional religion is persisting in modern nationalism, right? So as one person put it, nationalism defines the past of a people, their future or salvation, and the sacrifices necessary in order to claim salvation and win the future. That's a religious language, right? That's a religion, what we call civil religion. I'll come back to that in a minute as well. So we see concepts of modernization as we go through the last 50 years up till today, of modernization increasingly focusing on worldview, on political modernization, not simply the state structure, and more thinking about this in religious terminology. And by the way, again, all these scholars, despite the fact, good morning, Michael, nice to see you, despite the fact that these scholars are here at Van Leer, they're all not talking about Jews. I did find one book that we have on Jews, which is Sarah Stein's famous book, Making Jews Modern, which I'm sure many of you have read. What makes Jews modern? Acculturation, embourgeoisement, politicization, secularization, and urbanization. That's Sarah Stein. New possibilities, she says, opened up, right? New possibilities of language, education, secular knowledge, new political options, gender roles, dress, and identity. And that's what I'm interested in exploring for the next 23 minutes, which is how we can think about modern Jewish politics and modernization, not stam as politics, but as a religious category embodying all of these cultural choices. That's really what interests me. Now, I don't have to, I think, tell many of you in this room, but modern Jewish politics, we know from Yisrael Tao and from many others in this room, is not simply some sort of response to anti-Semitism or some sort of failure, but rather is itself an evolution of Jewishness, right? Zionism, for example, we now know, is not simply, or primarily even, I would say, some sort of response to anti-Semitism or the failure of emancipation, but rather itself something coming out of the Haskalah, coming out of the ethnic roots of the Jewish nation, and out of modernity itself, right? The ability of isolated political ideas or distant pogroms, fair enough, to become part of the realm of experience of large numbers of people in an age of rapid communication and transportation. Urbanization, railroads, rapid mail delivery, and the proliferation of news media meant the penetration of new ideas into heretofore isolated groups, as well as a growing sense of national community based on this shared discourse. That's my first book. Fine. So nationalism is eventually going to be victorious, right? That's also part of the nationalist zeitgeist, especially in Austria-Hungary and especially in Galicia. But there are multiple paths to modernization. I'm going to come back to this at the end. If I'm going to say what I would regret from my previous work, I think increasingly I'm realizing the extent to which we have to separate nationalization and politicization and separate the victory of nationalism to a certain extent, but I'll come back to that at the end. So there's multiple permutations. There's a chaos of ideas as Jews are modernizing into this, and politically modernizing, right? Zionists in Galicia are going to rail against Poles and Polonization in Polish language periodicals, while Orthodox leaders who couldn't speak a word of Polish will support the Polish conservatives. Self-described, quote-unquote, assimilationists will encourage young Jews to study Hebrew and express Jewish pride, while Zionists will hold rallies in Polish, insisting that Jews who are a nation based on Hebrew or Yiddish, neither of which they could speak or read. En Kol Chadash Tachat HaShemesh, spent some time in America. This is pretty familiar. So, what are the categories? Now, I want to recall here Ezra Mendelsohn, Zichron Levracha. This was for me and for some of you, I'm sure, the kind of opening to this world back in the 90s. The categories of modern Jewish politics, which he devised, and for me, even before I met Rachel, this was really him and Moshe Samet and others were getting me into orthodoxy as a political option. The two aspects of this I want to emphasize now. One is the fluidity of it, which maybe I'll get back to later if there's time. But the other is the issue of identity, right? It's, as much as it's about politics. So if we think about first the innovation from the 90s and the 2000s of orthodoxy as a modern, the 80s really, from Jacob Katz, right, of orthodoxy as a modern form of Jewishness, which is now Pshita, and then we understand orthodoxy as a political form, right? Political orthodoxy, and what that means. I sort of want to go back and return to the issue of, go back from politics and say that this politics is itself a religious category. And not just orthodoxy, all of them, and especially Jewish nationalism. So if we think, for example, here are the famous questions that Ezra Ezra posted in his book on modern Jewish politics, page 5, if memory serves, about what each of these modern forms asked, right? How are Jews defined? What are the Jews? A nation, a religion, or what? And I would add, what are the boundaries of Jewishness, right? Who are the good Jews and who is the un-Jew? And maybe Yavin. That's one question, right? Linguistic cultural orientation. What should be our languages? Where's the future? And this means also what's the meaning of the land of Israel? What Jewish past, what allies, what tactics, and so on. And I would add to these, and I'm very interested in this question myself now, what texts, what traditions, what sacred narratives, what rituals, what leaders, right? That's what all modern Jewish politics are asking, and that's what all modern Judaisms are asking, right? All forms of modern Jewishness are asking these questions, the same as political orthodoxy, the same as all forms of modern Jewish nationalism, Zionisms, and so on. And that's why, for example, when I speak about Jewish nationalism, I think of it in terms of this issue of civil religion, right, or competing civil religions of nationalism. This is the famous work of Robert Bella, who really popularized the concept of nationalism as a civil religion in the 60s. It goes back to Rousseau, but he's the one who really got it back in discourse. And, you know, when I think about Zionism in Galicia, which is my primary focus, I think about the things that Zionists are doing to assert their authenticity, right? The flag, the stripes of the tallis, the Star of David. There's a famous story I love from Sanz, where a Zionist group comes to Sanz and they have a Star of David on their Hanukkah celebration. Hanukkah is its own thing, which Francois has written about. And when that happens, the Rav of Sanz is so upset that he says we have to tear the Star of David off of the parochis and off of our tefillin bags because it's Matama Gevoren, it's no longer Jewish. And it was still Jewish, but he was right that it had been appropriated by the Zionists, but it was no longer Jewish in the same sense. And the Zionists broke into the shul and carved a Star of David, a Magen David, into the shtender. The next morning, the Rav came and took the shtender and threw it out the shul and said it's more offensive than if he had carved a crucifix. So there is a sense of the way Zionists, at the time they recognized the way Zionists are appropriating these symbols. Holidays, of course, some are more useful than others. Hanukkah, most importantly, selective use of history, and other key symbols, right? All of them reinterpreted. Which texts are important? Joshua, pretty darn important. Isaiah doesn't get much play these days in nationalist Zionist spaces, right? Not so useful unless you're Yeshaya Leibowitz. It's not so useful. So these are categories of thinking about modern political modernization in terms of identity, in terms of religion, right? And again, I could go on about this much longer, but I'm down to, I think, 18 minutes. So here's the categories, right? And I don't think for this crowd I have to go through all of them, what they are. Integrationism, which is often called assimilationism because they themselves called themselves that, but we know, of course, it didn't mean that. It meant an integrated, hyphenated, maskilic identity, orthodoxy, and so on. So what I'd like to do in the time that I have is sort of shift to Galicia and think about how these options played out in Galicia, because honestly, I'm not a Galicianer. I have no dog in this fight, as it were. I'm the worst. I have German on one side and Berdichev on the other. It's like the most anti-Galician you can, and not Litvak, I guess, thank God. But I don't have a dog in this fight. But really, we all know, right? The Galicianers are the heart of all of this. They're the ones who are innovating all this because of the context. because they are a massive Jewish population experiencing emancipation in 1867, and because of the impact of the new, not constitution, but, basically constitution, series of basic laws. I guess in Israel I shouldn't call it constitution. Series of basic laws. And most importantly of all of them, Article 19, which establishes national minority rights, famously, but not for Yiddish, right? It's based on Umgangssprache. Yiddish doesn't count, so not for the Jews. However, you have to have a census every 10 years, and that census establishes nationality, and the combination of that effect is going to have an effect on the Jews of Galicia. Skim. Yeah. So, and when I say political cultural, I really mean that, right? You can measure political modernization through cultural outlets. So, for example, think about the theater. The first German language theater was established in Lemberg in 1776, a Polish theater, I guess in Lviv, in 1809, a Ukrainian theater in Lviv in 1864, and a Yiddish theater only in 1890. So these are sort of establishing how when these languages are coming to the fore, and therefore those forms of modernization. And if we think about Rachel makes this point, and I have to give my colleague a plug. If you haven't yet bought her book, you absolutely should while you're here. But this is part of the context, right? Because of emancipation and because of the political importance of the Jews in the area, this is why we're going to see these movements come out here first. And specifically, I'm starting with integrationism and orthodoxy, as Rachel points out, because in Ezra's book, he describes orthodoxy as sort of a latecomer to the games of modern Jewish politics, thinking about Agudas Yisrael, that makes sense. But if you look at Machzikei Adas, if you look at Galicia, you realize that actually integrationism and orthodoxy come first, and only later do we get the more famous socialist and nationalist movements. Integrationism, not assimilation, despite the fact that they called him that. Emil Bick, who again, my sins I remember this day, who I lambasted terribly in my earlier work, and I feel very guilty about that because he was a decent guy. He really was, and he, he had a good vision for the future of Jews that I think I appreciate as I get older more and more, albeit that he was an oligarch. So they come first to Galicia, famously with Shomer Yisrael, which was established before emancipation but becomes a political organization afterwards. I think it was 1867, I think at the same time in any event. And then because of the new rules to the election in 1873, they become politicized. They make an alliance, quite famously, with Germans, with Ukrainians and Germans against Poles, which sort of works for a few years, but then as the province Polonizes, they start moving towards a more Polish identity, although Bick never quite makes it. The famous group Agudas Achim, which the Zionists love to call Agudas Akum. They have nothing if not clever. Machzikei Adas, by the way, which I'll talk about in a second, very famously, Mazikei Adas. We've lost our talent for clever jibes, I guess, in the modern period. So, and they produce Oichizna, right? At that point, they become totally Polonized. And of course, they have a Hebrew language supplement, right? They're using Hebrew language because they support Hebrew. They support the hyphenated, moderate, Maskilic vision, right? Their opponents don't give them credit for that. And as I pointed out in my book, it was Shomer Yisrael and these moderate integrationists who established the first Zionist, they didn't realize what they've done, but they've established the first Zionist organization in Galicia. Mikra Kodesh was established by these people because they really do support proud Jewish identity, Hebrew language, and Jewish knowledge. Although when Agudas Achim loses its office because they close down, the Zionists take over the actual physical space, and they sort of, to them, that's victory, right? They celebrate the conquest of Agudas Achim. Orthodoxy, as we all know, again coming through first in Galicia with Machzikei Adas, right? Not only religiously not the same as traditional Jews. This is already Pshita, but also politicized, and they spread this identity through their paper Machzikei Adas, which is incredibly important, and now scanned, thank God. But from my perspective, and Rachel makes this point as well, we're still dealing with an elite here. The newspaper's beginning to affect people, but we're still dealing in a sort of a pre-mass politics phase. So very important innovations. but not yet at the stage of mass politicization. That's going to come. But I want to quote something that maybe a quote that some of you might know from the editor, an early editor of the paper. This is brought. I took the translation from Davidovic's book on East European texts. Yitzchak Evan, who talks about the paper. Here's what he writes. It gives us a sense of the importance of the press. Belz and Sadiger, Machzedek Das was of course connected to the Belz Hasidic group. Belz and Sadiger differed about how to safeguard Hasidism against modernity. Belzer Hasidim had a deep antagonism to Sadiger, for they could not forgive the Sadiger transgressions in dress, downing the styles of modern Europe. Among the Hasidim of Belz, Jewish traditional dress was a dogma, 14th creed, ani mamin. Men had to wear a high fur hat and flat shoes with white socks. Belz was especially outraged by the high fashion clothes of the women of the Sadiger court. In 78, the Belzer Rebbe, Joshua Keach, convened a rabbinical assembly in Lemberg to found Machzedek Das. Its purpose was to publish a newspaper to strengthen Hasidism and piety among Galician Jews, to combat the Shomer Yisrael of Lemberg and the many periodicals of the Haskalah. Sadiger utterly opposed the newspaper, in their opinion that would bring about precisely what the Machzedek Das was intended to combat. I was editor of Kol Machzedek Das for several years. I do not want to spit in the well from which I drank, but I must speak my mind. The historian writing about the Jews of Galicia will have to give much credit for the modern cultural development of today's Galician Jews to the Belzer Rebbe and Machzedek Das. For the truth is, not Yosef Pearl, not Nachman Krochmal succeeded in raising the intellectual level of Jewish youth in Galicia as much as did this Hasidic Hebrew paper. Without intending it, not even aware of what it was accomplishing, the newspaper made fertile the soil on which Hebrew schools, the modern Hebrew language, and Zionism flourished. The Sadiger Rebbe was right. This fanatic Hasidic paper, which dared not mention a word about the Zionist Congress, stirred Hasidic youth from their lethargy and propelled them out of the prayer houses, first into the tents of the Maskilim, and then into the arms of the Zionists. And a similar argument I'll show you in a second was made when the socialists, which I'll talk about in a second, had their first successful, or temporarily successful, strike in Kolomea in 1892. And Nathan Birnbaum and other Zionists were outraged. How could you let these modernizing Hasidim, how could you let them fall into the hands of the socialists? And David Silberberg said, what are you talking about? Who cares? They're politicizing, and eventually they're going to be ours. They're starving, so they're striking. But it doesn't mean the socialists have them. I'll come to that in a second. Or actually right now. Socialists. Oh, sorry, I want to mention one thing. When I was enjoying the library here, I found a great text on Chile. And there was an article on Catholic priests in Chile who went through the same evolution. First, they opposed mass politics, trying to control the situation. And then when it was out of control, they simply tried to take over the mass political movement and direct Catholics towards the conservative party, threatening anyone who would listen to them with religious sanctions if they opposed them, which is quite interesting. Jews are human, the comparative study I think is very, very important. It's one of those things I always am humored when I come to Israel, because you have the machlaka, you have the division of Jewish history, and then everything else history. There's some kind of connection between, Peruvians and Japanese and Norwegians. That's all one thing, and then Jews are something completely different. I always think of that when I see these connections. Socialism. Sorry? Apologies?
It was a low blow.
It was a low blow. Hebrew University? Oh, sorry. Apologies. Said with a full heart of love. The point, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, I can't swear on it, but that point was made to me actually by Ezra, I think, if memory serves. I think he's the one who pointed that out to me at one time. It certainly wasn't my chiddush. Anyway, Jewish socialism, it gets going in the 1890s. I already mentioned that there was the Kolomea talus weavers strike in 1892, which was celebrated throughout the empire. You have references to it in Vienna. There's a strike fund that goes across the empire. The socialists were thrilled. They thought they captured the Jews, the politicizing Jews of Kolomea, and that they were theirs. Ultimately, of course, that's not what happened. They weren't joining the socialist movement, but the Zionists had that right to a certain extent. You do have an independent sort of Bundes party in Galicia, the GPS, the Żydowska, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Żydowska Partia Socjalno-Demokratyczna, I think I got that right, which was separate from the Bund, but basically got all of their propaganda materials from the Bund over in Russia. They had a lot more freedom, of course. That's part of the point of Galicia, right? as the Piedmont of all these nationalist movements. And they were the true assimilationists in many ways. Not the PPSD, but the Jewish socialists who wouldn't join, sorry, not the GPS, but the Jewish socialists like Herman Diamond who wouldn't join them. They were the true assimilationists. So this is what Herman Diamond, who was initially a Zionist and then became a socialist, here's what he wrote. There are no special Jewish traits worth conserving. All retention of Jewish uniqueness is deleterious. We have to assume new forms and not flinch at the difficulties encountered in Polish society. We must spend every effort to eliminate all manifestations of uniqueness. This was not going to be a particularly successful move in Galicia, but this was part of the modernization going on, and certainly some people were attracted to it. There was also Polezion, founded in Austria and very powerful in Galicia, which when push came to shove was going to align itself not with the socialists but with the Zionists. And I say that literally because they made endorsements for elections and they sided with the Zionists, not with the socialists. For them, that was the key difference. And finally, I have 6 minutes left to talk about Jewish nationalism. I don't know how that happened. The point I guess I would emphasize here is twofold. First of all, as I write about in my book, that Zionism, by that name Zionism in Galicia, it was not about principally any kind of political program geared towards Palestine. Because of the conditions of Galicia in part, it was overwhelmingly, not completely, but overwhelmingly diaspora focused, and it was focused on constructing what the Basel program called National Selbstbewusstsein, right? National self-consciousness. They wanted to nationalize the Jews. They wanted to construct a sense of Jewishness. That was their goal, overwhelmingly. And I guess my broader point about this, I think, is a window into the function of Zionism more broadly, that this is how it operates. It's operating as a form of Jewishness for people who are not attracted to other forms of Jewishness. I don't have time to talk about Bloch, but I do want to talk about Leibel Taubes and others who established this Yiddish press in the 1890s, and their goal is essentially to construct the Jewish nation along the lines of Benedict Anderson's observation 100 years later. The Prince Media Anderson writes, allowed otherwise isolated individuals or communities to become aware of the hundreds of thousands, even millions of people in their particular language field, and at the same time that only those hundreds of thousands or millions so belonged. These fellow readers to whom they were connected through print formed the embryo of the nationally imagined community. This is precisely what the Zionists in Galicia tried to accomplish, and I think to a certain extent did accomplish this, right? That's why I think 1907, when you have 1897, actually, we already have a curia that anyone can vote in, and any man can vote in. In 1907, when you have universal manhood suffrage, this is the moment where you really see mass politicization. The rallies, this is a famous one featuring Nathan Birnbaum, the rallies really exemplified Jews having this broader worldview. That said, and I could speak more about this another time, but that said, I want to temper my conclusion. And if in the end of my book, I celebrate, maybe that's too strong a word, I recognize or I acknowledge or I see a kind of victory of nationalism because I look at the political spectrum of modern Jewish political parties and I see them all advocating some kind of national program. I see the integrationists, the assimilationists advocating a kind of Jewish national program, even as they think the best way to accomplish it is with alliance with the Polish conservatives. I see the Orthodox advocating a kind of national program, obviously the Jewish National Party, and the socialists. Everyone but Diamond, basically, are advocating a kind of Jewish national program in Galicia. And I think, oh, wow, politicization sort of means nationalization. But I think over the last few years, I'm tempering that to a certain extent, and I think we need to separate these. And I saw this, I'll just conclude with this point, because Andrei's here, and Lada is here, and Yaroslav is here, but I want to talk about Drobic for 2 minutes. So a few years ago, I did this big dive into Drobic, which I sort of sat on for a while, and I finally released it this summer, on the Election Day Massacre in 1911, in which you see, which was a huge news event across the world, not just across the empire. I found reports on front page of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Tennessee, and Alabama, and New York, of course, and they're all talking about Drobic. I mean, it's remarkable, and their details are pretty good. They get it. They're not so off in terms of the actual numbers killed and so on. They don't know why it happened correctly, but they have a sense of what happened. And the truth is, what happened was that an inter-ethnic clique of Jews who saw themselves as Poles and Catholic, Jewish Poles and Catholic Poles were trying to keep themselves in power. And there was an inter-ethnic clique, which was represented by a Zionist, to be sure, Gershon Zipper, of Ukrainians and Jews, and some Poles for that matter, who were trying to topple them. And as a result of that, in a way I can't get into right now, there was this massacre. But what happens is that the nationalists take this story and reframe it as a nationalist struggle in all of their papers. The Jews do it in all of the various Jewish papers. This is a Polish painting which represents it, and in the description it talks about how the Poles are trying to resist Austrian suppression and reassert their rights. You can see the shul, which was, I think, just sold a couple years ago, in the background. So they got the location right. This is on the bottom of Strisky Street, a block from the Ring, well, those of you know Drobich, a block from the Ringstrasse, right where the theater meets the corner. But they're Poles, right? And I have Ukrainian stories about seeing them as Ukrainians. So everyone's sort of nationalizing this. And this famous poem that, that made the rounds all over Galicia, which was really a Bundes poem, a song, but reframed to understand it as a nationalist uprising against these terrible assimilationists, and eventually makes its way into a Hebrew song as well by Shlomo Artzi, right? So the nationalist reframing is victorious. But actually the story was one of mass politicization, but lav dafka nationalization. I don't think nationalism was really at the heart of what was moving these now modernized, politicized Jews and Ukrainians. So in retrospect, I think, as I said at the beginning of the paper, that I think that I need to spend more time while recognizing that nationalism is growing as part of this sort of spectrum of identities, recognizing the persistence of other ideas as well, other factors as part of it. I think it's 30 minutes. I'll stop there. Thank you all very much.